On 21 November 1970, a U.S. Air Force HH-3 Jolly Green Giant crashed into a North Vietnamese compound 23 miles west of Hanoi. Inside were 14 highly trained Green Berets who immediately exited their damaged aircraft and began to eliminate stunned North Vietnamese Army soldiers. The leader of this group of Special Forces troopers was Captain Richard J. Meadows, a combat-proven leader and a growing legend in the U.S. Army. Captain Meadows' troops quickly moved to their positions, clearing rooms and eliminating all resistance, while Dick Meadows called on a loudspeaker, "We are Americans. This is a rescue. Keep your heads down." The compound was the Son Tay prisoner of war camp, and this was the most epic raid of the entire Vietnam War. Richard J. Meadows was born on 16 June 1931 in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia to a coal miner, moonshiner dad who imbibed his illegal brew and afflicted his wife, Hattie, and Junior with his often belligerent, sometimes violent behavior. It was his grandparents, John and Fanny Booth, that gave him the love and affection all children crave. He learned to hunt squirrels, deer, turkeys, and to catch raccoons in traps baited with crawdads he would catch in the creeks. His grandfather and uncles Oscar and Henderson were tough men who taught young Richard how to survive and thrive in the wilderness. In 1947, at age 15, his mother changed the date on his birth certificate so that a 15-year-old Dick could pretend to be 17 and enlist in the U.S. Army. Richard attended basic at Fort Lee and then Fort Jackson for basic infantry training. Though he had been an athlete in high school, he struggled physically because of his age and small stature. But compared to his life in West Virginia, 3 squares a day and regular paychecks was far better than his previous life. Exhausted at the end of every day, he thought he might be sick, but he never went to see a medic as he feared many of the instructors knew he was too young and were looking for any excuse to bounce him from training. After graduation, he was supposed to go to airborne school, but Dick only weighed 125 pounds, and 130 was the minimum weight for airborne school, so he served on KP until he packed on the weight and then went to jump school. This is when airborne school still produced paratroopers and not the modern parachutists. His black hat was Sergeant First Class Bradshaw, an 82nd Airborne veteran who couldn't abide boys in his beloved division. But Dick had a guardian angel, a huge Hopi Indian, who would see Bradshaw focusing on Dick, and before he could harass Dick, the Hopi would make some obvious military error that would focus the attention on him and not on young Dick. On graduation day, Dick saw SFC Bradshaw homing on him like a sidewinder. Instead of another ass chewing, Bradshaw stuck out his hand. "Son, you're going to be one hell of a paratrooper." He was assigned to the home of the airborne, Fort Bragg, where a disappointed Dick was assigned to the artillery. But Master Sergeant Eddie Powers, a leg, squared him away and taught him all the intricacies of artillery, the king of battle. Dick thrived and was promoted to sergeant and volunteered for Korea in November 1950. Dick found himself in the 3rd Infantry Division, first supporting battles and then in the thick of it, watching both buddies and other soldiers getting wounded or killed. Chinese snipers were terrifically demoralizing, and after listening to the stories of D-Day veterans who served alongside him, he realized that everyone was scared and everyone hid it. After 3rd Division was relieved, he went back to Japan and trained on the M2A2 105mm howitzer, where he was promoted, again, 20 years old and the youngest master sergeant in this man's army. Returning from Korea, Dick joined a newly organized classified unit called Special Forces. Post-World War II had seen multiple Allied nations disband all their special operations units that had operated behind enemy lines. This included the OSS's Special Operations Branch, the British SOE, and SAS. Except the expansion of communism throughout Eastern Europe had alarmed Western nations, and one of their responses was to create or reconstitute their special operations capabilities. The Brits stood the SAS back up in 1947, and in 1952, the U.S. Army created 10th Special Forces Group, built along the lines of both the OSS's Special Operations Branch and the Army officers who had stayed behind the lines when the Philippines fell and fought a guerrilla war for nearly 5 years. Assigned to 10th Special Forces in Bad Tolz, Germany, Dick thrived and continued to improve his skills. In fact, he excelled in spite of what was an unbelievable inferiority complex about his poor education. He exerted himself tremendously, reading voraciously, including all the military manuals he could find. What was a weakness, he turned into a strength, and was considered one of the most brilliant and competent NCOs in Special Forces. When Captain Elliot Bud Sidnor was getting his indoctrination tour on joining the 77th Special Forces Group at Fort Bragg, he noticed a tall, confident soldier and asked his escort who that was. "Oh, that's Master Sergeant Dick Meadows. He gets all the best missions because he always succeeds." Across the pond, the Brits had noticed the successful activation of U.S. Army Special Forces, and Colonel Dare Wilson, commander of the 22nd SAS, reached out to General William P. Yarborough, commander of the Special Warfare Center at Fort Bragg, about doing some cross-training. This resulted in Master Sergeant Dick Meadows and Captain Bud Sidnor doing a 1-year tour with the Brit SAS in 1960. Dick Meadows, being Dick Meadows, volunteered for the SAS's brutal 2-week selection course. Captain Sidnor described Dick as the man most justified to brag about his skills and knowledge, but who was in fact the most modest. Deeds, not words. In fact, Sidnor and Meadows became the first foreigners to be awarded the coveted SAS Wings badge and beret since its post-war activation. Sidnor served as a troop commander and Meadows as a troop sergeant. Meadows deployed with his troop to Norway and Denmark for training, and also to the Sultanate of Oman. It was during his time in Hereford that 2 SAS troopers decided to play a trick on Meadows and invite him to a freefall jump. SAS troopers Cliff Eastwood and Pete Sherman had become good friends with Meadows and were informally pursuing freefall parachuting. Meadows was not a skydiver, but went along realizing they were having him on, and not until he was wearing a parachute and hanging onto the wing of an aircraft flown by an apparition looking too much like the fictional Biggles did Meadows realize that Eastwood and Sherman weren't kidding. They were hungover from the previous night's celebrations. Meadows jumped, forgot to count to 5, realized he forgot to start counting, saw the ground coming up shockingly fast, gave it another second, and pulled. It seemed he landed right after his chute opened. A white-faced Sherman and Eastwood approached him, ensuring he was okay. He wasn't. Meadows was hooked. As his tour ended, Meadows took home one piece of unauthorized equipment, at least unauthorized by her father, SAS Sergeant Major Spud Thompson. It turned out his daughter was just as tough as her father and wouldn't take no for an answer. So Pamela Thompson gave her heart to this young man, hoping he wasn't the stereotypical American overseas in Britain, overpaid, oversexed, and over here. Meadows immediately volunteered for Laos after returning to Fort Bragg and found himself serving with Field Training Team 59 at Muang Am Camp in the remote Laotian highlands as the detachment sergeant for a 7-man team. The overall commander of this was Lieutenant Colonel Arthur D. Bull Simons, and the operation was called Hotfoot. But soon after Meadows and his team arrived, it was renamed Operation White Star. They focused on training local Khao and Mio, also known as Hmong, tribesmen. Meadows and his team spent months training these men, but when time came for action, the SF troopers were restricted from accompanying them into combat. Meanwhile, their bases were being regularly mortared by the Pathet Lao. One of the most frustrating experiences was when SF Captain Walter H. Moon and Sergeant Orville Ballinger were captured when their base at Ban Pha, northwest of Vang Vieng, was overrun on 27 July 1961. The CIA had an asset that was able to report the location of Ballinger to include a description of the interior of the house where he was held, and Bull Simons had Meadows draw up a plan for a rescue. Meadows and one other soldier would halo in and provide reporting and even take out any exterior guards prior to an all-out helicopter assault. Simons approved the plan, but had to seek permission from William H. Sullivan, the U.S. ambassador in Vientiane. Sullivan refused. Ballinger remained a prisoner until August 1962. Meadows returned home on 25 May 1962, reporting for duty at 7th Special Forces Group, but found he was personally requested by Bull Simons as an advance party to Fort Gulick in the Panama Canal Zone, as Bull stood up the 8th Special Forces Group, courtesy of the threat posed by Fidel Castro and the revolution he was attempting to export from Cuba. When the Cuban Missile Crisis flared up, Meadows' team was tasked with knocking out the SS-4 and SS-5 medium and intermediate-range missiles the Soviets were building in Cuba. Meadows and his team were fully jocked up and aboard an aircraft orbiting just off Cuba for a few hours before the Soviets blinked and backed off. Meadows also led his ODA in a 10-day security exercise called Black Palm, targeting the Panama Canal locks defended by Panamanian National Guardsmen, who quickly found his team, arrested them, and threw them in jail. The next morning, all had escaped. 24 hours later, the governor was told to check one of the locks, and divers found dummy explosives wired to the flotation chambers that gave buoyancy to the huge locked doors. Meadows' team had successfully demonstrated the vulnerability of the Panama Canal. On 30 November 1963, Meadows married Pamela Thompson in the Canal Zone. Bull Simons had given her the third degree on why she wanted to marry one of his boys. Pamela was a little nervous from Bull Simons' grilling, but later became firm friends with him and his wife Lucille. On 21 July 1964, Pamela gave birth to a son, Mark Richard Meadows. As proud as Dick Meadows was, he was mentally preparing for the escalating war in Vietnam. In November of 1965, within months of returning to Fort Bragg, Meadows had orders to 5th Special Forces Group in Vietnam. His feet barely on the ground, he was contacted by Lieutenant Colonel Bull Simons, the deputy commander under Colonel Donald Blackburn of the highly classified Studies and Observation Group under Military Assistance Command, Vietnam. By rank, Meadows should be an operations sergeant as a senior staff NCO, except Meadows chose to lead a recon team. Bull Simons gave him 2 months, and Dick recruited a team of Americans, Arvans, and Nungs. He was meticulous in his planning, constantly rehearsing immediate action drills, and ensured his men were in top physical shape. He had such a tight team that the members never wanted to leave. Meadows made RT Ohio one of the most capable and successful teams in Command and Control Central. His men uniformly considered Dick Meadows the best 1-0 in all of SOG. In June of 1966, he received a briefing on the difficulties of prosecuting the war in Vietnam. The U.S. military was sure that the North Vietnamese were supporting the Viet Cong in South Vietnam, but lacked any hard proof. Pham Van Dong, the Prime Minister of North Vietnam, had assured the entire world that there were no soldiers from the People's Army of Vietnam, aka the North Vietnamese Army, either in South Vietnam or in Laos, the country that bordered both North and South Vietnam. The U.S. military was almost positive Pham Van Dong was lying through his teeth, but lacked any proof they could show the world. So, Colonel Jack Singlob, the new chief of SOG, sent a number of RTs to find that proof, and RT Ohio, Meadows' team, was inserted into Laos. RT Ohio was hit as they were moving off the HLZ. Meadows charged into the ambush, returning fire with his suppressed Swedish K submachine gun, flanked by two other members of his team, Billy Joe Antony and Arvin Lieutenant Lee Min. Meadows killed two and Antony killed a third, while the remaining three escaped. The three dead soldiers were dressed in the typical black pajamas of the Viet Cong, indicating they were South Vietnamese communist insurgents. After breaking contact, they conducted 2 days of methodical patrolling and found a 5-meter wide path that was actually Laotian Highway 110E. Above them they could see the branches of the surrounding jungle tied across the road to conceal it from aerial observation. It was part of the complex of roads and paths more famously known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They found a bend in the trail as it followed a river and waited. They soon observed Viet Cong insurgents with AK-47s slung walking down the trail. Then a column of NVA soldiers, laughing and talking, completely unaware of the SOG team watching them. One NVA soldier stopped to take a piss only 6 meters from one of the team. Dick photographed them with an Olympus Pen EE half-frame camera. He also used an 8mm movie camera and filmed more NVA soldiers walking by, worried the noise of the camera would expose him, while Lieutenant Min covered him. The last NVA that had disappeared around the corner kept looking behind him, seemingly right at Dick. After they were alone, they held a team conference. Dick believed that the last NVA had been looking for stragglers lagging behind. Dick proposed capturing one of these stragglers. The team agreed. When 2 men staggered down the trail under heavy packs, Dick stepped out, Swedish K at the ready, with Nguyen Can Thach, or Teddy, his interpreter, who gave them quiet orders in Vietnamese. They dropped their loads and were quickly taken prisoner. All evidence was pulled off the trail as the 2 prisoners were led away, their hands bound behind them. A welcome rain began to fall that would help obscure their tracks. RT Ohio moved silently with their 2 prisoners, and once near their extraction LZ, they called in the coordinates of the trail for an airstrike. In fact, Meadows was particularly good at prisoner snatches and holds the SOG record of 13 POWs captured in Laos and Vietnam. Though Dick thought they had done a pretty good job, he did not realize the magnitude of what RT Ohio had just accomplished. His film was rushed to the Pentagon, irrefutable proof that Pham Van Dong was lying. The NVA was indeed moving large amounts of personnel and gear into South Vietnam. Meadows had to report to Saigon to personally brief General Westmoreland. Not long after that visit to Saigon, Meadows was back briefing Westmoreland on his latest reconnaissance mission. RT Ohio had found another section of the Ho Chi Minh Trail and followed it to a massive clearing completely camouflaged from aerial observation. In the clearing were 4 Russian-made artillery pieces. As RT Ohio lacked the explosive to destroy these weapons, they instead stole all the optical sights and dumped all but one in a river. They then called an airstrike and exfilled. Meadows presented the last artillery sight to a delighted General Westmoreland. Then, on 12 October 1966, Westmoreland had a mission specifically for Meadows. Admiral Roy Johnson, Commander 7th Fleet, had requested help to recover a downed pilot. Navy Lieutenant Robert Dean Woods had ejected into North Vietnam from his A-1H Skyraider. An SH-3 Sea King helicopter couldn't rescue him because its harness couldn't penetrate the thick jungle. The next day, bad weather restricted all flying. Woods was uninjured, but was only 15 miles from the NVA garrison in Than Ho. Now, SOG had recently created bright light teams specifically designed to go in and get recon teams that were in contact and trying to escape. Bright light teams consisted of up to 60 heavily armed Green Berets and Special Commando Unit soldiers that could bring overwhelming firepower to a fight. Within hours, Meadows and his 13-man team were en route to the USS Intrepid to be briefed for the mission. The Navy knew exactly where their man was hiding, but there was nowhere to land on his ridgeline. Meadows found a possible HLZ a half a mile away, a place where a helicopter could hover and his team could jump out. Except the Navy told him orders from Washington restricted any Americans on the ground on this mission as it was in North Vietnam. Would he ask his SCU Nungs if they would go? Meadows didn't like that at all, but asked his team. They agreed, but were very sad that Meadows, Anthony, and Kearns wouldn't be going. Meadows begged Admiral Johnson, who reached back to Westmoreland. Westmoreland gave permission, and Meadows did not know if he had received permission from Washington or if Westmoreland was taking all the responsibility. On the fourth day, the weather broke, and the team took off in 2 Sea Kings. Meadows described the flight as horrific, while the Navy pilots chattered and joked as they dodged heavy anti-aircraft fire as soon as they went feet dry. They made the HLZ, jumped out, and immediately heard NVA shouting all around them as the search for the downed Navy pilot was still in full swing. RT Ohio moved quickly to Lieutenant Woods' ridgeline, following a trail, and ran into a squad of NVA. Meadows killed the first 4 members while the rest scattered. He called out to Woods because he knew he should be near, but heard no answer. Contacting the aircraft above him, Meadows found the Navy had only just learned Lieutenant Woods had been captured. They moved to an HLZ, and a Sea King began to hoist them out. Hit by ground fire, the helicopter had to abort, with only Chuck Kearns and a few Nungs aboard, and 2 Nungs falling out of the sling as it departed. Recovering his 2 Nungs, Meadows and the remnants of RT Ohio went into the nearest cover they could find, a bamboo thicket. It was great concealment, but you could not move in it for the noise it would make, and as they were surrounded, it would only tell the NVA exactly where they were. Meadows did the only thing he could do. He called for any fast movers to fly directly over them, hoping the noise would drown out their movements out of the bamboo thicket. Navy pilots immediately understood what he needed and did multiple low passes at treetop height, allowing Meadows and the rest of RT Ohio to temporarily escape. They found another area on a ridgeline with smaller trees that would let them hoist out, and the Navy Sea King swooped in and extracted the rest of the team. Back on the USS Intrepid, Meadows learned that Chuck Kearns and the Nungs on the first helicopter and its crew had survived. As that Sea King was limping back to the carrier, Kearns had all his Nungs put on life preservers and threw them out of the wounded SH-3 before it crashed, jumping right after them. All were picked up by a rescue boat. All of RT Ohio survived, though some were wounded. If the weather had broken sooner, they probably would have rescued Lieutenant Woods. Years later, Meadows met Woods and presented him with the pistol he had taken from a dead NVA officer that day they had inserted to rescue him. This first bright light mission of the Vietnam War precipitated Meadows' 3rd meeting with General Westmoreland, who, on Colonel Singlob's recommendation, offered Meadows a battlefield commission to officer, the first awarded in the Vietnam War. In November 1966, his tour ended, and he returned to Fort Bragg, assigned to 6th Special Forces Group. Of his time in Vietnam, Meadows said, "Of all the jobs that were going on in Vietnam, I believe that being a 1-0 on a recon team was the finest of them all. I'm proud to have fulfilled one of my personal aims in Vietnam. I swore to myself that I'd do my best to make sure that I never lost a soldier. And you know what the key to that was? In my opinion, it was detailed planning, training, and boldness. You've got to think boldly, plan boldly, and then go boldly. Boldness gives you a surprise, and surprise is one of the best assets a soldier can have in combat. You've just got to be bold." On 14 April 1967, Dick Meadows was commissioned an officer, skipping 2nd and 1st lieutenant and going straight to captain. His friend Arthur Bull Simons pinned on his bars. By October of 1968, he was back in Vietnam serving as the ops officer for the Strata program based at Monkey Mountain, supporting teams of Vietnamese, Cambodians, and Nungs as they did 2-week missions observing the Ho Chi Minh Trail and calling in airstrikes. One time while serving as a covey rider supporting a team on the ground, Meadows and his pilot were shot down. His pilot managed a crash landing and both were rescued, though Meadows was able to recover the propeller to decorate his office. Meadows kept asking to lead missions, but this was when President Lyndon Johnson had restricted all bombing in North Vietnam and restricted Americans from participating in the Strata missions. He got his chance in March of 1969 when a Marine Corps Operation Dewey Canyon ran into trouble, and the strike force sent to assist also got pinned down. Meadows was authorized to assemble and brief a task force to infiltrate the enemy's rear area, to kill, destroy, and create confusion, and to gather intelligence useful to the Dewey Canyon operation. Some of the men with him were well-known and respected Special Forces troopers. Meadows' task force consisted of 2 full platoons, 2 reconnaissance teams, and a headquarters element. He had 10 Americans, 2 ARVNs, and 66 Special Commando Unit soldiers, for a total of 78 men. On 7 March, the first lift of 2 was inserted and immediately came under fire. The second lift made it the next day, and Meadows spent the next few days maneuvering towards Lieutenant Colonel Smith, commander of the 3rd Battalion, 9th Marines. Movement was slow in the bombed and wrecked terrain and hampered by periodic fogs, and Meadows' task force had to stop and destroy ammunition caches they would find. The Marines were being heavily mortared, but as the task force got closer, they could hear the tubes firing and were able to silence them with both artillery fire and 500-pound bombs. On the 13th, Meadows' task force linked up with 2 Marine Corps companies and moved towards the Marine Battalion command post. By the late afternoon of the 14th, Meadows and the 2 Marine companies linked up with the command post and took positions in the battalion perimeter. Soon after this link-up, the Marines were resupplied, and Meadows was ordered to extract his task force. This frustrated Meadows immensely, as he didn't think the mission was over, but he was overruled, and his task force was withdrawn. Happily, the Marines took no further casualties and were exfilled soon after. Captain Meadows was sent to Marble Mountain to take over the command and training of a reconnaissance company, something at which he excelled, but he was frustrated by the missions his company was asked to perform. He did not believe that bomb damage assessments, collecting soil samples, making corrections to maps, or counting bodies was worth the time of a highly trained reconnaissance team. Somebody higher up was failing the risk assessment just to obtain low-value information. In late July 1970, Captain Meadows was back at a desk at Fort Benning as the ops officer to the patrolling committee of the Ranger Department. He got a phone call from the Pentagon with orders assigning him to Joint Contingency Task Force, Ivory Coast. This tasking came directly from the Office of the Special Assistant for Counterinsurgency and Special Activities, namely Brigadier General Donald Blackburn. When he arrived in Washington, D.C., he found himself in the company of his old commander, Colonel Bull Simons. The mission was to rescue 61 prisoners of war from the Son Tay camp in North Vietnam, 23 miles west of Hanoi. Meadows immediately recalled his team's attempt to rescue Dean Woods, which happened within 100 miles of Son Tay. He assumed that this mission was right up Sog's alley, except General Blackburn believed, rightly so, that it would have been too difficult to maintain operational security. Ivory Coast was one of the most classified operations of the entire Vietnam War. They trained at Eglin Air Force Base, Florida, 2 MC-130 Combat Talon crews, 1 HH-3 Jolly Green Giant, 5 HH-53 Super Jollies, and 5 A-1E Sky Raiders, all to deliver 56 Green Berets to the Son Tay camp. Meadows was given command of the Blue Boy element, 14 Green Berets who would crash land in the HH-3 into the courtyard of the walled prison camp in order to allow them to reach the prisoners quicker than any guards. They trained relentlessly for nearly 2 months in preparations for a late November launch window. This led him to the controlled crash landing inside the Son Tay camp, where Meadows' call on the loudspeaker received no response. His men confirmed the worst news. Dick broadcast negative items to Lieutenant Colonel Sidnor, the ground force commander. It was a dry hole. There were no prisoners in the camp. The team withdrew as planned and returned to Thailand, with nearly every Air Force and Army raider feeling as if they had failed their fellow servicemen. And of course, the media piled on, ever ready to kick the military when they are down. Meadows returned to Fort Benning and the job he loved there, and his next assignment was with 1st Special Forces Group in Okinawa, where he served as the operations officer for all of 1st Group, a job usually held by a major. In January 1975, Meadows received his final assignment for the Army before retirement to Camp Rudder, Florida, near Eglin Air Force Base, where he had trained for Son Tay. In June of 1977, he retired from the Army and planned to settle down at their home in Crestview, Florida. On 4 November 1979, organized students and other followers of the Ayatollah Khomeini took over the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, Iran, taking 53 Americans as hostages. Meadows, now retired and working as a civilian consultant, accompanied Colonel Charles Beckwith, commander of Delta Force, to Washington, D.C. for consultations on a potential rescue. This plan was incredibly complex, but it required operatives on the ground in Tehran to acquire the vehicle transportation to take the Delta Force operators from Desert 2 to the targets in Tehran, and to transport all of them to a stadium for exfil. The problem was, the CIA had no assets in Tehran. All the CIA officers they had in country were already hostages, and all were out of contact, necessarily so, with any assets they ran. Meadows volunteered to go into Tehran, and though the CIA was not happy, they had nobody else. So the CIA agreed and gave him some basic tradecraft training and prepared his false documentation. Meadows flew into Tehran and, posing as an Irish businessman, went through immigration without incident and stayed at the area Sheraton, where he was able to make numerous observations of the embassy compound and the lackluster Iranian student guards. Meadows was not alone and had with him an Air Force enlisted man, Fred, who was fluent in Farsi, having been born in Tehran, and a couple of highly competent Special Forces soldiers from the Berlin detachment. On the night of the Joint Task Force infiltration into Desert 1, Fred and Meadows waited at Desert 2, a salt mine, where they would link up with incoming Sea Stallions and Delta Force operators. What Meadows and Fred didn't know, that though the C-130s had all arrived at Desert 1, the Sea Stallions were another problem. They only had 5 flyable, 1 short of the minimum. A disappointed Beckwith ordered the abort, knowing the entire operation could be remounted in a few days. But one of the Sea Stallions, when moving to a refueling C-130, hit a brownout and crashed into the C-130. 8 men were killed, and Meadows and Fred knew nothing of the abort because atmospheric conditions had prevented communications. Near morning, when they finally got the message, unable to deliver the auto parts, he assumed the abort was a delay, and he and Fred went back to the hotel. Crazily, Meadows learned of the catastrophic accident through a phone call from H. Ross Perot, who told him about the disaster, and that evidence left at the scene mentioned the warehouse where the vehicles were kept, and the code name of his operation, indicating the Iranian intelligence service was likely just learning they had American spies in Tehran. Meadows and the SF guys were able to fly out of Mehrabad Airport, while Fred spent 4 weeks traveling cross-country until he successfully crossed a friendly border. Meadows' contract with Delta ended soon after, and he found himself working in the corporate security world. He spent a decade on and off working in Peru, earning a stellar reputation with the locals, government, military personnel, and the U.S. Embassy. Then a medical checkup back home gave him staggering news. He was in the advanced stage of leukemia and had only a few months to live. Meadows learned he was going to receive the Presidential Citizens Medal and be inducted into the Ranger Hall of Fame the same day as the Son Tay Raiders Association reunion dinner on 29 July 1995. He looked forward to that day as he felt very honored to be in the Ranger Hall of Fame. He went to the hospital for his final transfusion on the 28th of July, but it was found his condition had deteriorated too much for a transfusion. With Pamela at his side, he passed away in the early morning hours of 29 July. He rests with the best near his friend, Bull Simons, in the Barrancas National Cemetery at Naval Air Station, Pensacola. But the most unbelievable thing about him was a statement he made in the last days of his life to his biographer, Alan Ho. "I regret that I've not done anything significant. I wish I'd had one chance to lead a hugely successful mission." Now, I would be one to certainly disagree with his self-assessment of his own accomplishments, but his reflection reveals a truth that all fighting men know. We don't fight to defeat the enemy. We fight for our brothers. Numerous times, Dick Meadows had led men into combat to rescue fellow soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. In 1961, he was preparing to rescue captured Special Forces Sergeant Ballinger and a journalist captured in Laos. The mission was canceled before it even started for lack of political will. In 1966, he went in with his recon team to rescue Navy Lieutenant Woods, but weather delayed their insertion. When his team finally got on the ground, they realized from intercepted communications that Lieutenant Woods had already been captured. Later, he was sent on a still classified mission into North Vietnam to Site Eagle between Hanoi and Haiphong to recover a team of CIA CAS agents, but the agents had already been captured. In 1970, he led the Blue Boy assault team that crash-landed into the courtyard of the Son Tay prison camp, only to learn that the prisoners had been moved. In 1980, he was undercover in Tehran for Operation Eagle Claw, only for the operation to be aborted due to aircraft failures. Richard Meadows no doubt took these failures personally, but he did not realize that every time someone asked, "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" Meadows always answered, "Here am I, send me."